any prediction on the outcome of Friday's summit between Presidents Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Speaking to Russian state television after landing in Alaska for the talks, Lavrov has said that Russia's position is clear and unambiguous and will be presented directly during the meeting. This comes as exiled Russian opposition figure Yulia Navalnaya has urged Presidents Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump to strike a deal to free Russian and Ukrainian political prisoners held captive by Moscow for speaking out against the war in Ukraine. Navalnaya, whose husband Alexei Navalny died in a Russian prison last year, said this in a video message on social media, hours before the two leaders are set to meet in Alaska today. Now for this discussion, we are joined by Madhav Nalapat. He's the editorial director at TSG. Thank you, Madhav Nalapat, for joining us today. Good to see you. Now, Lavrov has stated that Russia will not predict the outcome of this summit. Given the sensitive issues at hand, how do you see this approach influencing the atmosphere of the talks?
Well, look, for the Russians, quite frankly, Alaska is a big deal. And for President Trump, it's a huge feather in his cap where newspaper headlines are concerned. The media of the whole world will be looking at the Alaska summit between Putin and Trump, because Putin will finally have come in from the cold after he began this war with Ukraine. And no less a person is, and the president of the US is now breaking bread with him in Alaska. So from the point of view of President Putin, the fact is that these territories, Donetsk and Lugansk, were essentially Russian territories that were given to the then Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. It was part of the unified Soviet Union. And it was basically given, if I remember, by Ukrainian-speaking General Secretary of the all-powerful General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And for the majority of its unhappy period as a communist country, the Soviet Union was under the control of general secretaries who were Ukrainian. So the majority of, the majority of those who held that position were Ukrainian, not Russian speaking. So the reality of the situation is, as far as Russia is concerned, they will not stop trying to annex the whole of Donetsk and Lugansk, because these territories, they believe, were ceded to Ukraine when they were both unified under the USSR. And now that Ukraine has gone its own separate way, very much its own separate way, the Russians would want these territories to be back, as well as Crimea. And I don't believe they're going to do any adjustment unless it involves a full restoration of those boundaries that were there prior to the secession, the handing over of these Russian-speaking territories to Ukraine by under what was then the unified Soviet Union. So I do not see any prospect of the Russians abandoning their stand of going full tilt and getting back the whole of Donetsk and Lugansk.
Thank you, Madam Nalapat. And now also looking at Yulia Navalnaya, who is a widow of Navalny, urging both leaders to strike a deal for the release of political prisoners. How likely is it that this issue can be discussed at the table today?
Well, it can be discussed, and it's a great tragedy. I think, there are many prisoners of war held by Ukrainians and by the Russians, and an exchange would be welcome from a human rights point of view. Whether that's going to be arrived at, I'm not very sure. I don't think, frankly, that President Putin is in the mood to make any concessions to the Ukrainian side at this point in time. So given that, I'm not very sure that the prisoner exchange situation will come about. But if it does come about and the Russians do agree to prisoner exchange, well, then that will be another big feather in the cap of President Trump. And I think, the Russians would use that possibly to buy time to finish the job of reclaiming the whole of Donetsk and Lugansk.
Thank you, Madam Nalapat, for sharing that. Please stay with us as we stay on this topic now. In